So this is the solution to all of our problems, right? This is the panacea. This is the truth. This is what we've been waiting for. Yes? Well, of course not. That's very silly. Project management just flat out is hard work, and there is no easy way around it. This can improve things and make things easier for it, but it still reduces to managing people, solving conflicts, successfully doing all those communications, using all those soft skills, and no one process or no one methodology guarantees success. It's all about people and soft skills, and that still exists, but this can smooth the way. This creates a better environment for us to be successful in this very competitive, globalized world today. But still, the truth is what it's always been. Again, it's always about soft skills, and there's a lot of art as well as science and processes involved in successful project management. Agile will help us do this by smoothing that environment. So it's not the perfect solution in all cases, and there's a number of projects, many projects today, where the old traditional waterfall predictive approach will still be needed. So if the customer does know what they want going into the project and they have some very specific detailed design requirements, we handle it traditionally. We do the predictive planning. We get all the requirements up front. So this is a fit for firm fixed price contracts. If we're subcontracting major parts of the project, then at least for those parts that we're subcontracting, often those are going to be under a fixed price contract, but we're probably not going to be co-located with the subcontractor. There's not going to be that same type of chemistry between our team and the subcontractor's team. And so, and there's not that, maybe oftentimes not that level of trust between our company and the subcontractors. We are going to have everything nailed down in the SOW for the contract and the terms and conditions, and we are that more command and control type of project manager managing the subcontractor. So the old predictive planning approach is better for that. If our teams are virtual, if we're spread out over a large geography, then it's going to be a lot more difficult to create this agile culture, this agile ethos, to have our daily stand-up meetings, to be able to get up out of your chair and walk around the cubicle and talk to the person and see all the body language. You're not going to be able to do that. But people are trying to implement agile in virtual teams today. And so using some of the modern techniques for conference calls, video conference calls, they could perhaps do their daily stand-up meetings that way. And if they have very tight requirements for team members for responding to email messages and responding to voicemail messages, and the team's really working within that, then we can try to make this work. But it's definitely going to make it more difficult when the people are spread out over a large geography. If there's a lot of complexity, there's many different deliverables for the project, and we've got different teams working on the different deliverables, and there's interdependencies, there's logical dependencies between these deliverables, then we're probably going to at least need one person or a couple of the classic project managers to schedule that work and integrate it all and track what those dependencies are and know what that is. So we're needing more of a traditional approach to glue all that together and handle the integration. And for whatever reason, if there's a lack of trust, people don't, senior management, the customer, they just have the superficial, naive understanding of what Agile is all about and really not appreciating or understanding what their role is going to be to make this successful, then we're probably going to go back and be more protective and cover ourselves and make sure we've done things in the more traditional way and do predictive planning for every aspect of the project. I think as we again move into the second decade of using Agile, and Agile is being used for much larger projects and much more complex projects where there are these logical interdependencies and this complexity, that actually then the use of Agile ends up evolving and it becomes a hybrid project. So parts of the project are managed and handled with an agile approach, and parts of the project are handled with a traditional approach. And for the integration of all the pieces, again, we probably need the more classic project manager that has the WBS for everything built out and the schedule and is handling the integration of all this work and the dependencies of all this work together. So I think we're really in this second day of Agile. I think most projects are really becoming hybrid projects. Writers on Agile are saying today, a number of places are just implying that really there's probably just 15%, maybe 20% of the projects are suitable for just a pure Agile or pure Scrum approach. And then maybe another 15% or so of the projects are best suited for the traditional predictive approach. And then in between, the remaining 65% or whatever, those projects in the middle are hybrid. Some of the writers in Agile today say, we'll handle those as a scrum of scrums. So still use an Agile approach, but have the Scrum Masters all meet together too and do stand-up meetings. Well, I think, again, if there's a lot of complexity and a lot of interdependence between these projects, then again, we're going more the full 9 yards and having all those tools and those pieces that we said would be needed in traditional project management. So the complete WBS, a complete schedule, do all the classic types of risk planning, predictive planning that were involved, but mix in the Agile approaches too. So who is going to do this integration? Do we have just a classic project manager that's doing the integration, working with all the Scrum Masters, people managing the individual iterations? Or I think sometimes that's translated and ends up becoming a role of the product owner. So I think in Agile environments, these hybrid environments, the product owner role gets to be very, very interesting. And I think they're ending up evolving, and they're kind of your classic product manager. They're planning out the product roadmap for this product and the set of products through the releases. But they're also learning all kind of project management skills and Agile skills to make this all work. So it's kind of interesting how this is all going to work out. Oftentimes, I think in that complex environment, again, the customer senior management are going to want one point of accountability, that one focal point, the quote-unquote one throat to choke. And so this is who's ever integrating all things together. Maybe oftentimes that's going to become that product owner. Okay, my last part of the presentation deals with risk management for some specific areas for the project. So for schedule risks and for budget risks, I think Agile really brings to us some neat, some interesting creative tools for dealing with those risks as opposed to what we use for traditional project management. So what do we use in traditional project management to help protect from delays on the schedule? From the schedule, what gives us a level of confidence for where we're likely to finish on schedule, and what do we build for that? We build in reserves. We build in schedule contingency reserves to protect us from risk for the schedule. And what tools do we use for that? We use more analytic tools. So the big one is Monte Carlo for PMI, so Monte Carlo simulation, modeling and simulation. And we're going to do it quite differently with Agile. It's going to be a more of an empirical approach. So let's look at some slides on this. So traditionally, what's described in the PMBOK guide, by the way, the traditional approach for protecting ourselves from schedule risks and budget risks was to calculate contingency reserves. We're either going to calculate schedule contingency reserves to protect ourselves from schedule delays and cost contingency reserves to protect us from overrunning the budget. But in order to do that, we had to do in-depth planning. Up front at the beginning of the project, we're doing exhaustive, detailed, in-depth planning for all aspects of the project. We first got all of our requirements. We rolled those up into a very detailed narrative scope statement. And then we did decomposition and we broke down that scope statement to the WBS, this hierarchical chart, and the lowest level of detail down each branch in the WBS are, of course, the work packages, but all about nouns, all about things, all about deliverables. They could be plans or documents, but they're about deliverables. And then we did more decomposition and we broke this down even further to the activity level. So all about verbs. And there's a many-to-one relationship. These activities, verbs, are really tasks. PMI doesn't call them tasks, but that's what they mean. There's a one-to-many relationship. So perhaps 5 to 10 activities, perchance, for each work package. So if you had 200 work packages in your WBS and you had 5 to 10 activities for each work package, then you have between 1,500 and 2,000 activities that make up the schedule. So now you can get very detailed estimates of resources that are needed for each of these 2,000 activities. So people resources, skill sets, that's telling you labor rates, but also resources like tools and equipment and facilities, and rental rates. So you also talk to the resources, you get their opinions of what duration should be, and now you know the resources, so you know labor rates and rental rates, you know durations, so you can just multiply those two together to get your cost estimates. So we're at a very granular level, we're at a very detailed level, and we've got these cost estimates for all 1,500 or all 2,000 activities, and we can sum it up and we can roll it up into the cost baseline, and we're rolling up the duration estimates for the activities. We're rolling that up, figuring out a critical path and figuring out the duration of the project. But we also, into these duration estimates and to these cost estimates, we added contingency reserves based on risks. Have we done this before? Is this very technically challenging? Is the resource doing? Is this new to them? And if so, maybe you want to add some reserve amount, some extra time into the duration estimate. So your programmer gave you the estimate of 6 days to do this activity, but you're seeing that they haven't really done this type of thing exactly before. There could be some significant risks, some technical challenges. So you gave them an extra day of time in that duration estimate. You built in some contingency reserve. And that translated, or when you worked out the cost estimates, that extra day of time for schedule reserve basically is getting translated into a cost contingency reserve. So we're rolling up contingency reserves into both the schedule baseline and the cost baseline. And furthermore, we could try to get more precise. We could do PERT 3-point estimates, get an optimistic estimate, a most likely estimate, and the pessimistic estimate, and use that to compute a PERT average. And that's also getting a more reliable estimate and helping protect ourselves against risk. Once we've got that, we can also use quantitative risk techniques. So in quantitative risk analysis, we'll use some even more specific tools to help us at the project level kind of recalibrate and recalculate these contingency reserves. So we'll come back to this slide, but let's go look at a slide about using Monte Carlo with these PERT estimates. So once we've got these PERT 3-point estimates for all 1,500 or 2,000 activities, then we can use Monte Carlo. So when we added up all the PERT averages, so we did the PERT formula to get the PERT averages, get the expected value for all these activities. We summed that all up for these cost estimates, and we ended up thinking that we need $250,000 to do this project. But now we use Monte Carlo against all this data, and Monte Carlo is running through all the different activities, and it does it multiple times, perhaps 2,000 times, 1,000 times, or 2,000 times. Each time, running through the schedule, looking at the activities, it randomly picks one of the 3-point cost estimates for each of the activities, and it sums it all up, and it comes up with an estimate of what BAC is, or what do we budget for the end of the project. And it does it over again and over again and over again 2,000 times, and it produces something like this, an S-curve, a probability distribution that shows us our likelihood of where we're going to finish on budget. And we could do the same thing for schedule. So what's Monte Carlo telling us here? What's our likelihood in its mind, in doing its simulations? What's the likelihood that we're going to finish this project and spend $250,000? Not too good. And only 50%, actually a little less than 50% of its simulations did we end up coming out at $250,000 or less. So I don't think that's giving you a real warm and fuzzy that you're going to finish this project at 50%. And if you wanted a 75% confidence factor of where you're going to finish on budget, Monte Carlo is telling you that you really need $320,000 in your budget to get that 75% confidence factor. And you could do the same. You could have Monte Carlo tell you what it is for an 80% confidence factor. So it's giving us our likelihood of where we're going to finish on cost and finish on schedule. So let's go back to our previous slide and try to tie up the loose ends here. So Monte Carlo gave us our likelihood of where we were going to finish on budget, or where we were going to finish on schedule. And in the previous slide, it said if you wanted a 75% confidence factor, you needed $320,000 in your budget. So it's basically telling you what you need in contingency reserves. And it's one way to help you calculate your contingency reserves. And again, you could just do PERT modeling, PERT estimating all by itself instead of Monte Carlo, and use those alternative techniques too. But for this to all work, you had to do that very detailed predictive planning for all parts of the project up front at the beginning, because PERT, so Monte Carlo is dependent on PERT, and the other modeling is dependent on PERT, and it's only as good as the weakest link. And in Agile, in projects with volatile requirements, you don't have all that detail for all of the project. You might have, for your first iteration, you might have the requirements defined in detail, but you don't even know what you're going to need out in iteration 3, iteration 4, iteration 5. You don't even know what the backlog is going to be, so you can't plan it in detail. You can't get these detailed estimates. Therefore, you can't use PERT, and therefore you can't do the PERT modeling. You can't do Monte Carlo. It's all predicated on traditional project management, doing the in-depth predictive planning, getting the complete WBS and the activities for all those work packages in detail planned out completely at the beginning of the project. And most of our modern projects, and many of our modern projects today, we cannot do that. So with Agile, we're going to solve our problem in quite a different approach. We're going to use an empirical approach for figuring out what's our likelihood of where we're going to finish on schedule, and therefore what our budget is. We know what the cost is of each iteration. That's defined because we know what the resources are that are being used in each iteration, and each iteration's time box. So if we can estimate accurately the schedule, how long it's going to take to do this project, then we can accurately predict and forecast how long the project's going to take and what's our likelihood. So we're figuring out risks, but a different way, empirically. The predicted analytic approach, as we described, is not going to work, so we're going to use this empirical approach. And the team is going to get relative estimates of the size of each story, of each requirement that makes up the iteration, that makes up the sprint backlog. We're going to get relative estimates of each of these stories. Is it a 1? Is it a 10? Is it a 15? You know, what is it? It's not an estimate of the duration for the story, just how do these stories stack up in comparison to one another, which one's small, which one's a 1, which one's the biggest. So the product owner goes through all the stories for the iteration, for the sprint, and describes them all. And as he or she is describing each of these stories, the team members ask questions about the story, and the product owner answers those questions. And the team then, each team member has a deck of cards, a small deck of cards with numbers on each of the cards. And these are for rating the size, the relative size. So the first, oftentimes they're going to try to pick out, people rate which of the stories is smallest, which of the stories is biggest. So they rate those and put numbers on those, and then they go after the ones in between. So each team member then lays down a card for the story, and they put it face down so the other team members don't see how they've rated this relative size. And then when everybody's played their card, they flip the cards over. The person who rated to be the smallest relative size explains why they rated it that way. The person who rated it the largest size explains why they rated it that way. And then other people ask questions, the team discusses it, and then you go through a second round of rating the team lays down cards, and you go through a second round of rating each of these stories. And the numbers will start converging towards a single rating, relative rating of each of these stories. And you do this enough iterations until you converge to a single number. And again, these are relative estimates, so it's not really telling you durations. So how the heck do we translate that into durations? We measure our velocity during each iteration and from iteration to iteration. So this evens everything out. This test, we now can put durations with basically those relative estimates. And this also allows us then to create burn down charts. So let's look at 2 slides that show us velocity. Okay, the numeric values that each story got rated at as they converged to a single number, those numeric values for each story are the story points of the story. And so we sum up all the story points for the iteration, and the team here thought in their plan, they thought that they could do 30 story points in each iteration. So they're going to do 30 story points in iteration 1 and another 30 story points in iteration 2. And then as we start moving through the iteration, we see what our velocity is, and we see that actually we're not going as fast as we planned, and in iteration 1 we only got about 26 story points done. And we can forecast outward, so we can project, and we can see at this velocity then we're not going to get 60 story points done at the end of iteration 2. We're going to be in the low 50s or something like that. So we can forecast, we can project, we can see what's the risk, what's the likelihood of where we're going to finish on schedule. And we had thought that we were going to get perhaps 180, 190 story points done at the end of iteration 5. And perhaps that's the last iteration for this release. And we're seeing that's not going to happen. We're going to be closer to 150 story points at the end of iteration 5. So now the management team and the customer have some choices to make. So we can either decide to delete some of the stories. So if the key thing is meeting the schedule and finishing at the end of iteration 5, if that's the key constraint, then we can delete some stories, perhaps move that into a different release. Or if the those stories are vital, then they could allow for more time and move this project out into iteration 6 to finish. So this is empirically, we're seeing what we're doing. We're measuring our velocity. It's allowing us to forecast. It's allowing us to basically measure the buffer of what we need to finish, where we're going to finish on schedule. So we can easily flip this side and see it as a burn down chart. So the burn down chart is just another interesting way to view our velocity and see what's our progress completing the different stories on the project. So it's the inverse, if you will, of the velocity chart. And again, for this project here, we had 180, 190 story points, and we thought we were going to complete them all in 5 iterations. That was the plan. And given our velocity, given our actual performance, we're seeing that that's not going to happen. So we're measuring our completion of the stories from iteration to iteration. And the burn down chart's really, for you earned value folks, it's really showing you ETC, estimate to complete, and how ETC is decreasing from iteration to iteration. And so we can see, we're forecasting, we can see that we're not going to get all 180, 190 story points finished at the end of iteration 5. That's going to, if we want that all done, it's going to go out into iteration 6. So again, they've got choices to make. So just a nice chart. It's showing the same information basically as the previous chart, but just inverting that. So today, we live in a very interesting time, a very, very challenging time. This world of hyper competition, extreme volatility, a lot of risk for companies and individuals working in companies. It's very interesting. It's, again, that world that Thomas Friedman and Michael Mandelbaum described in their book, That Used to Be Us. Because of globalization, because of the IT revolution and the internet revolution, companies can come together kind of in the drop of a hat in ways that were never dreamed of before, and pull together disparate manufacturing pieces, marketing pieces, other pieces, and put that all together very, very quickly. So it's much tougher to compete in this world today. Companies need to be much better at doing projects and addressing all this change. Therefore, they need their project managers to be very up to date with these agile methodologies and be able to take advantage of all these tools that come to bear. But we're using Agile in a lot of places that they didn't 12 years ago with the advent of Agile, and they're using it in places that involve much larger projects and much more complex projects where there's logical dependencies between parts of the project and teams working in different places. Some of this can be handled as a scrum of scrums, but we probably, in a lot of places, are going to need that classic project management team, all those traditional approaches, because there's a lot of logical dependencies. So, therefore, I believe that as project managers today, we have to know the traditional project management tools and methodologies and approaches as well as Agile. We've got to know it all to be successful. There are going to be parts of the project where you are going to need to plan them in detail and do that predictive planning, perhaps use those classic risk techniques, quantitative risk analysis techniques for those pieces, and other parts of the project where it is about the art of the possible, and it is about discovering and exploring new requirements and being creative. And probably for those pieces, we're going to use more tools for doing our estimates and doing our forecasts, and for protecting ourselves from risk. We're using tools like velocity, measuring velocity, and burn down charts. Oftentimes in this complex hybrid world, we're going to need one project manager, that one focal point. Maybe that's the product owner that is this focal point for the entire project, is the one throat to choke, is integrating all the pieces together and using classic methods. So I really appreciate having this opportunity to do this presentation for the Washington, D.C. chapter and do this webinar. I learn a lot all the time putting together these presentations, so I certainly do welcome your questions And if even talk on the phone about any of these topics, or meet you at another Washington D.C. dinner meeting, that would be awesome to discuss this further. So you can reach me at mark@bestpmptraining.com. That email address was on the first slide. And just as reference for further reading, if you're as interested in these topics as I am, then these are books. I found these very, very useful and tremendous nuggets of wisdom and information to help us be project managers are connected in these books here.